Hello, welcome. We are going to get started in just a minute here. Let me pull up my screen and we will dive right into the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. A few things before we get going. First of all, we're so sorry that we had to cancel our in-person meetings that were scheduled in Pittsfield, in Roxbury, in Lowell, Bunker Hill, and Springfield. We really were hoping to get to all of those. We were able to hold two meetings, in one in Fall River and one in Worcester, but we're really saddened to have to have canceled those, though under the circumstances, it makes sense, but we appreciate everyone bearing with us as we move forward with this kind of alternate version. And so we're really glad to have everyone here, both on the webinar as well as anyone who might be watching this recording after the fact. So the second thing I want to note is that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted within a couple of days, and that will live at the kind of web-based clearinghouse for all of this information, www.mass.gov/2050roadmap. So that link will pop up again in the presentation. But with that said, I'm Claire Maziolik. I'm the Decarbonization Study Roadmap Manager. I'll be joined by Han Shu and Benjamin Miller, who are the GWSA Program Manager, and Ben is the technical lead for this study. And we will be presenting several pieces of information. So during the next 30 minutes or so, we'll share information on the Global Warming Solutions Act, looking backwards at historic greenhouse gas emissions in the state, the recent net zero emissions goal for 2050, our current analytical and planning process towards reaching that goal, and look at some examples of system-wide transformations that past research have indicated are necessary for deep decarbonization. So if you have any clarifying questions for the presentation, please type those in to the GoToMeeting panel as we present. We will address those as best as we can right after the presentation, and then we will open up the line to hear from you if you'd like to make a comment verbally. So if you'd like to do that, when we move to that period, please raise your hand and GoToMeeting, and I will take you off of mute. And please keep your comments to about a minute. We have a large group here, and we want to make sure we're able to hear from all of you. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Han to dive into the information, and let me give you, Han, the keyboard so that you can click forward.
Great. While you do that, I'll say hello, everyone. Hope you are doing well this morning. Am I okay? Great. Okay, great. Just testing. All right. Hello, everyone. So yes, as Claire said, I'm going to provide a little context for you all on what the GWSA requires, and as well as some information about our historic greenhouse gas emissions. So the Global Warming Solutions Act, it was passed in 2018 to address the grave threat of climate change. Its passage made the Commonwealth one of the first states in the nation to move forward with a comprehensive regulatory program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. The law requires a comprehensive science-based approach to inventory and reduce our statewide greenhouse gas emissions, charging the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to evaluate the total potential costs and economic and non-economic benefits of various reduction measures to the economy, environment, and public health, using the best available economic models, emissions estimation techniques, and other scientific methods. The GWSA also charges the Secretary of EA to set 10-year emissions limits and publish implementation plans to achieve them. The emissions limits are legally binding. The 2020 emissions limit was set at 25% in 2010, and it was accompanied by the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020, which outlined a comprehensive suite of policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors. Our Secretary, Kathleen Theoharides, is setting the 2030 emissions limit this year and has commissioned analysis to inform where she should set that limit, as well as what policies should be pursued to achieve it. She also intends to set the 2050 emissions limit this year following Governor Baker's recent announcement of a net zero emissions by 2050 goal. More on these efforts later on in this presentation. In 2016, Governor Baker issued Executive Order 569 establishing an integrated climate change strategy to ensure that efforts to meet greenhouse gas emissions limits are consistent with and supportive of efforts to prepare for and adapt to the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events. Key elements of this executive order was codified in the GWSA in 2018 when he signed a $2.4 billion environmental bond bill. Two of those codified key elements are strengthening the resiliency of communities in Massachusetts and developing and implementing a statewide adaptation plan. The Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program is the Baker-Polito administration's grant program to support municipalities in planning for climate change impacts and implementing priority projects. Currently, 82% of the Commonwealth is participating in the program, and we've invested over $33 million across the state to date. The next funding round opens next month in April. You can go on to the mass.gov website to see contact information of your regional coordinator who can answer project-specific questions. The Commonwealth is also working to improve resilience within its own agencies. The Resilient MA Action Team is the state's interagency team working to implement the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. In its first year, RMAP has launched the online action tracker on resilientma.org to show our progress in implementing the plan and is working to develop new climate resilience standards and evaluation tools for state agencies. For something I can't continue. Okay, great. So now I'm gonna switch a little bit. So as briefly mentioned earlier, the GWSA requires an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions to know the emission sources in our Commonwealth, as well as establish a baseline to which emissions reduction progress can be measured. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection publishes a detailed annual statewide emissions inventory each year. Much of the data behind this inventory is collected locally and aggregated by federal agencies such as the U.S. Energy Information Administration and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This results in a lag of 2 to 3 years between the end of a calendar year and the corresponding data becoming available. In 2017, this is the latest year with complete data, emissions were 73.3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is 22.4% below the 1990 baseline. So that means we're, I believe, 2.6% percentage away from getting the 25% reduction goal. As you can see from the top blue wedge for electricity consumption, Massachusetts has very successfully reduced greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation and use since 1990 due to a combination of new low carbon generation sources and energy efficiency programs like MassSave. Direct fuel use in homes and offices represented here by the middle green and dark blue wedges, respectively. So that has decreased per capita, but since population has grown steadily, those emissions have remained at a steady absolute level. The fuel economy standards introduced in the 2000s have been successful in keeping transportation emissions in check, represented here by the big yellowish green wedge. But despite there is increase in it despite a steady, it's been steady despite a steady growth in the annual vehicle emissions traveled. In this graph, indirect emissions from electricity use are ascribed to subsectors on the basis of annual sales. As you can see, the commercial sector is the largest user of electricity. You can barely see the electricity use in the transportation sector, as this sector has been primarily powered by fossil fuel. While transitioning to a deeply decarbonized economy will require significant investment in new technologies such as zero-emission vehicles and renewable energy sources like solar and offshore wind, Massachusetts' efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have not only not held economic growth back, they have also spurred the development of an innovative, clean energy economy in the Commonwealth. This contributes about $13 billion to our economy, which is about 2.5% of annual gross state product. In 2017, Massachusetts residents and companies spent nearly $15 billion on natural gas and petroleum, including gasoline, all of which had to be imported from other states or other countries. Transitioning our economy to run on clean or renewable electricity means that almost all of that money can stay in New England, if not in the Commonwealth. So I am going to give the keyboard, back to Claire, who can transition to discussion about future emissions.
Great, thank you, Han. So now I'm going to dive into the 2050 time horizon and focus on zero emissions, net zero target. So at the State of the Commonwealth address this January, Governor Baker committed the Commonwealth to achieving this ambitious goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So what does that really mean? Net zero emissions means that Massachusetts will need to drive down the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit into the atmosphere to a level that is equal to the quantity of emissions that can be taken out of the atmosphere and stored. This graph here is illustrative, so the historic information with a black line from 2017 is based in our actual inventory data, but moving forward is for illustration purposes. But shows our historical emissions and charts out what an 80% greenhouse gas reduction path could look like, as well as alternate deeper greenhouse gas reduction path in that dotted line in the center there. In this case, there's X% of remaining emissions in 2050, but that is equal to the carbon sink shown here as negative X. These negative emissions or sink can be from biological processes, physical processes, chemical processes, or a combination of them all. And so what we're really looking to do is to achieve a balanced line that eventually does hit zero, because what we're putting out is equal to what we're taking back in for emissions. So I know there's been a little bit of confusion about the deadline around April 10th, and I wanted to clarify that there. We have an open comment period right now for feedback related to the setting of this 2050 emissions limit, and I'm going to frame that up in this slide. Those comments are due by April 10th because we're looking to set that limit pretty soon. However, general feedback and comments on the study are open at any time. There's no deadline to that. So the sooner you get the feedback in, the more time we have to incorporate it into the analysis. So with that, as indicated earlier in the presentation, the EEA Secretary plans to set the 2050 emissions limit to reflect this net zero emissions goal. And so we are looking specifically for feedback on this limit represented by the dashed line shown here, which would be the maximum allowable emissions in 2050. This level should be at least 80% below the 1990 baseline that can be balanced by a carbon sink of an equal amount or more. So the formal language we seek feedback on, it's written here, but I'll read it as well. A level of statewide greenhouse gas emissions that is equal in quantity to the amount of carbon dioxide or its equivalent that is removed from the atmosphere and stored annually by or attributable to the Commonwealth. Provided, however, that in no event shall the level of emissions be greater than a level that is fill in the blank. So we have 80, 85, 90 below the 1990 level. So as you can see in this image, the dashed line represents the ceiling for emissions. Even if we were able to get more sink than that equivalent level, our emissions could not exceed that dashed line. So in the case presented here in the middle, which would be compliant, we'd actually be in a net negative situation. So you can provide verbal comments on the setting of this level at the end of the presentation, or you can provide written comments at the website listed here, mass.gov/2050 roadmap. Those comments on the setting of this limit are to be submitted by April 10th by 5 p.m. Though again, there's another form on the website, kind of right next door, where we are taking feedback on the study more generally, and there's no deadline for that. So with that, I'm going to share a little bit more about the 2050 roadmap and how we're really planning for the Commonwealth to achieve that net zero emissions goal. So EEA is conducting a roadmap study to decarbonize Massachusetts. This is a comprehensive research effort that will identify the strategies, policies, and implementation pathways for Massachusetts to pursue in the next 30 years. The study will characterize impacts of policy implementation, including but not limited to greenhouse gas emissions, costs and benefits, socioeconomic equity, and public health impacts. The research will result in a roadmap report to show how the Commonwealth can achieve net zero emissions by 2050, as well as several accompanying technical reports to show how we develop that roadmap. During this process, we will also hone in on the actions that the Commonwealth will pursue in the next 10 years to put us on that path towards GWSA compliance in 2050. That analysis will inform the setting of the 2030 emissions limit and the development of an implementation plan to achieve it, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030. So you can see on the right here, we have our key deliverables for this process, a roadmap report, the setting of the 2030 greenhouse gas emissions limit, as well as the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030. So this project officially kicked off last July with the hiring of a consultant team led by Cadmus Group. We have about a dozen subcontractors working as part of this consultant team. I'll mention a couple who've done other work in the area. Arup has performed the building sector analysis for the Carbon Free Boston report and is leading our building sector analysis. Evolved Energy Research has done several reports on deep decarbonization pathways, including looking at the Northeast, the U.S., states like California and New Jersey. And Harvard Forest, who produced the 2013 Changes to the Land report on possible land use futures in Massachusetts, will be doing our land use analysis. The beginning of this project was focused on developing the technical analysis framework in consultation with EEA, other state agencies, technical steering committee of local academics, and other stakeholders. And since then, the team has been deep in the technical analysis and modeling work. We are expecting results over the next couple of months and plan to publish the 2050 roadmap and the Clean Energy Climate Plan for 2030 by December of this year. We've been engaging various stakeholders through this process, particularly members of the GWSA Implementation Advisory Committee, which is made up of leaders from the business, energy, environmental, buildings, transportation, and academic communities in Massachusetts. We've also been closely engaging climate justice stakeholders to make sure our planning process is inclusive and the policies and strategies that will result from this process are equitable. Bringing in feedback from the public at this middle point in the process, and it's important to ensure that we are able to incorporate your feedback into our study and deliverables. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ben Miller, the study's technical lead, to show more on the analytical findings. And Ben, there we are, right there. And Ben, I'm going to be giving you your the keyboard and mouse controls now, so you should be able to move the screen forward.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Just getting my bearings on the mouse control for a moment. Bear with me 1 second. I think we're good. Okay. So this is a complicated analytical process that we're undertaking. We will be examining 6 to 8 different pathways to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And you can think of pathways as packages of technological, economic, and other changes or outcomes that would define our energy systems in the future. To do this, we're using 2 different modeling approaches, essentially attacking the problem in 2 different but overlapping ways. One approach utilizes 5 sector models, which you can see here on the left, to explore fine-scale changes to specific subsectors, technology types, and interactions at a tight geographic resolution. The second approach uses a single all-economy, all-sector integrated energy and emissions model, represented here by the green rectangle, to look at primarily regional energy balancing. We'll then stress test at least one pathway to explore the effects of different possible futures, as well as explore and test a menu of policies that support those decarbonization pathways. While the policy analysis will look out to 2050, it will focus on policies we need to create and implement in the 2020s in order to achieve the 2030s emissions limit and set up deeper reductions past 2030. To stress test one of the pathways, the team will be running a series of sensitivity analyses based on 4 future scenarios that were developed with input from stakeholders. These 4 scenarios are meant to explore how a variety of different non-policy pressures could impact the strategies and policies that the Commonwealth should pursue and still end up GWSA compliant in 2050. Scenario A explores a possible future where there is uneven adoption of climate-friendly technology, partially due to a slow or low social response. Scenario B explores a possible future where there's high inertia in both technological change and social response. Scenario C explores a possible future where there is high social acceptance of climate-friendly technologies, but deployment of renewable technologies is slower due to high costs for a number of reasons. The final scenario explores a possible future where, despite high technological change and high social response, the impacts of climate change are severe, presenting challenges to our climate change mitigation efforts. Our roadmap study is still ongoing, so we don't have any results to show you at the moment. However, there are quite a few previous studies that indicate the direction that the Commonwealth should move, and to highlight some of the things that we expect that our results will end up showing in terms of how we'd like to decarbonize our economy and society. Most decarbonization studies focus on 4 primary strategies or pillars for reducing emissions. The first pillar is to increase energy efficiency. The second pillar is to switch to electrified and clean heating and transportation. And the third pillar is to expand clean energy resources. Energy efficiency and conservation are important because reducing the per unit energy needs of each building, each appliance, and each vehicle trip means that we can save on the associated fossil fuel emissions and reduce total energy needs and energy costs. Electrification of heating and transportation is also important because we can produce electricity with little to no carbon emissions using renewable technologies, other clean energy resources, and battery storage. As such, vehicles, space heating, water heating, cooking equipment, and other end uses should be powered by these clean and renewable energy sources wherever possible. Some studies have suggested that not every energy-using device in our economy could be electrically powered. Biofuels and other low-carbon energy resources can and should be reserved for such applications that are most challenging or impossible to electrify. Aviation is one good example of an application that is extremely difficult to electrify. The fourth pillar, increasing carbon sequestration, is critical to achieving net zero emissions, such that any remaining emissions we have in the Commonwealth in 2050 are netted, that's the net in net zero, out with carbon sequestration and storage. I'm going to take you through a few modeling results from previous decarbonizations that demonstrate some of the system transformations that each of these pillars would require. Now, again, these next couple slides are previous studies. Our study is ongoing, and these are not our results. The 2018 Deep Decarbonization in the Northeastern United States and Canada report is the primary source for these graphs. Indicates a growing number of, and that study indicates a growing number of vehicles on the road out to 2050, largely due to projected population increase. It also shows that the transition from gasoline internal combustion engines, or ICE, vehicles to electric vehicles, either plug-in hybrid, PHEV, or battery electric vehicles, BEV, will be necessary in order to meet an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The results indicate that traditional gasoline internal combustion engines should not be sold after the mid-2030s in order for electrification of light-duty vehicles to fully take place by 2050. It just takes that long to move from sales of vehicles for the entire vehicle stock to fully turn over. Other decarbonization studies also indicate a similar transition. Despite having more vehicles on the road by 2050, the graph on the right also illustrates that the energy savings associated with electric vehicles, which require much less energy to drive the same number of miles as their gasoline counterparts. Of course, reducing total vehicles and miles driven would be even more environmentally sustainable. Sorry, it's a little touchy. Come on. All right. These graphs are taken from the same 2018 study. They also show that most buildings, which are presently heated by fuel oil and natural gas, must switch to electric, air, and ground source heat pumps by 2050 in order to reach an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. In this analysis, the total residential heating stock is approximately 1/4 electric by 2030, 2/3 by 2040, and nearly 90% by 2050. As was the case with electric vehicles, we can see on the right-hand graph that because heat pumps are so much more efficient than their other heating technologies like furnaces and radiators, the overall energy demand for space heating declines even as the total number of homes increases. These results indicate that the electrification of personal vehicles and building heating will require quite a bit more electricity than in previous years. So where's all this electricity going to come from? That's a good question. Looking back in time, we can see on the left here on this kind of complicated slide, the vast majority of our energy comes from a few different fossil fuel sources. Out to 2050, deep electrification of vehicles and buildings will require significantly more electricity production, even with the energy efficiency advantages of both heat pumps and electric vehicles. In 2017, however, electricity accounted for just less than 20% of Massachusetts' final energy needs. Meanwhile, as shown in the pie chart, renewables accounted for just 7% of New England's electricity production. So generating much more electricity from almost entirely clean sources is another enormous aspect of reaching net zero emissions. In the graph on the right, 3 relatively recent studies analyzing an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050 indicate that twice the current electricity supply would be needed to meet projected electrification needs. While this transition may seem daunting, it's helpful to keep in mind that currently Massachusetts residents spend nearly $15 billion per year on fuels purchased in other states and other countries. Transitioning those energy needs to rely on locally produced renewable electricity can keep that money in our local economies. Our study is also examining the role that our forests which currently cover 3.3 million acres, or 67% of Massachusetts land area, and other natural lands can play in sequestering carbon. We believe there is significant potential for these natural lands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we recognize that they also provide co-benefits such as wildlife habitat, water filtration, and retention. As of 2019, 1.4 million acres in Massachusetts have been permanently conserved. For your role in the decarbonization of the Commonwealth, I'd like you to think about what you could do to ease this transition. If you're looking for a new vehicle, consider buying or leasing a battery electric vehicle or a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. For heating and cooling your home or business, consider installing a heat pump. Also consider supporting denser, smarter growth development and public transit, as well as urban forestry in your community. That's the end of our technical presentation, or my technical presentation. I'm going to try to hand this back to Claire for the moment. Claire, do you need me to click anything?
Nope, I think you're good. Thanks so much, Ben.
Okay,
Great. So at this point, we will mostly stop talking. However, if you do have any clarifying questions on the content for the presentation, please do type that into the question box, and we will go through those questions first to make sure that the clarifications are made at the front. So I know we've received several questions, but if you have any others, please type those in now. Once we go through those questions, if you would like to provide verbal comments, please raise your hand in GoToWebinar, and I will unmute you. We have over 200 folks on the line, so I'm asking comments to be kept to around 1 minute, and we will most likely we will definitely be taking note of your comment, but we will probably not have time to respond to them in the webinar. But again, it is being recorded, and these comments will be posted after the fact. And so what you can comment on is pretty open. So particularly the proposed emissions limit for 2050, we're actively seeking comments on that and hoping to use your commentary to help inform the setting of that limit. So very much welcome comments on that one. We're also really open to suggestions for implementation pathways, policies, programs, et cetera, that we should be considering in the roadmap report, as well as feedback on the anticipated system transformations that Ben just went through, if you have ideas or questions or concerns there. So again, around 1 minute, just to allow time for everyone who wants to speak to do so. I will remind folks that comments can also be submitted online at the link there, mass.gov/2050 roadmap. Comments on the 2050 emissions limit are being accepted until 5 p.m. on April 10th. And once all of those are submitted, we will be posting them online so that folks can see them and see the comments from other stakeholders through the Commonwealth. But there is another form for general comments that will be open throughout the duration of the study, and we check that form regularly. So if you have other feedback that you'd like to put out there, please do so. So with that, I am going to start making my way through the comments, and Ben and Han, I will ask you to weigh in as we need to, but a couple of clarifying things from the beginning. One is, I believe there might have been either in the audio or misspoken, but yes, for those who pointed out, the GWSA was signed in 2008, not 2018, so it is 12 years old, not 2 years old. So that is one thing we can clarify. Another question was the number of towns that were participating in MVP. And Han, I know it's around 80%. Do you have that number handy?
I don't believe I have that handy.
Okay, I think so. That information, that's not our focus area, but it is available on the website, and yeah, it is I believe around 80%, if not more, towns through the Commonwealth. There's also been several questions relating to the 2050 emissions limit, and one in particular that I think is helpful and a good framing is there do we know how much sink is happening in the Commonwealth to try to set that emissions? And that is something that we're studying right now. There have been several studies indicating how much forest sequestration there could be. There's also a lot of terrestrial sequestration happening in the state, but forests being the largest. But that is something that we're still looking to quantify through the state. However, if we set an emissions level that in state sequestration, natural sequestration was not able to meet, that would, I guess, put the Commonwealth on the hook for finding other means of sequestration. Ben or Han, do you want to weigh in on that question anymore?
No, the only thing I guess I would say is that there are definitely states in the U.S. where the total forest acreage is significant in comparison to the total population. A state like Maine, for example, Massachusetts does have a huge amount of forest. Most of its land is forest, but we're not one of those states where the total forest sequestration is massive in comparison to our total emissions.
Great. Another question was around the role of nuclear power, and that's definitely included in our historical emissions, and it's something that is being studied as part of the 2050 roadmap, the roll out over the next 30 years. So I know that there's been several comments around that. I think it's definitely included in the scope of the study, and as with all of this, the study is very much underway, so don't have any kind of answers to the role that it will play, but it is included within the scope of analysis. And another question was around two acronyms. So PHEV is plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and BEV is battery electric vehicle. There were also questions around the roles that cutting of trees would play in emissions. Ben or Han, do you want to explain how that's kind of factored into the inventory?
Sorry, so for the inventory, okay. Right now, the Massachusetts greenhouse gas inventory has a separate tab called the forest carbon sequestration tab. I think if you download the Excel inventory, you should be able to find it at the very last tab. And so it captures all the greenhouse gas emissions from biogenic sources, as well as all the sequestration from our forests in there. And there is in the calculation, there is an accounting for the loss of forest due to whether that's land use or forestry, but it's at a spatial scale that may or not be able to pick up all the forestry actions in the state, because we're looking again for statewide methodology. And so the current methodology that we have, obviously we would like to improve upon this as science and data become available, but at this moment the methodology is at a scale at least 30 meter or more resolution scale, and so we won't be able to assess all the different cutting unless it's like big scale cutting. Then it will show up in the spatial imagery that we use for our analysis. But we also, in between years where we have the spatial information, we interpolate the loss of forest with the number of building permits that are issued in Massachusetts. So that is one way for us to kind of figure out what the trend is in between data points. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but let me know. Okay.
Yeah, so I think so, and I think that I guess looking out for the net zero 2050 target, we would be we're working out how to take all of these factors into consideration. So ideas and comments on this are welcome as folks might react to the 2050 level. So we are at an interesting point where a lot of the comments that have come in are really kind of more on the substantive folks voicing either opinions or broader questions and not on the clarifying angle. So I'm going to recommend that we really start opening up the lines and allow folks to weigh in. And so the way that I'm going to do that is by I have a list of folks that look like they have raised their hand, and I'm going to start calling on you and unmuting you, and we will be looking for about a minute. And so hopefully to keep your comments to that and to make sure that we're able to get through them. So I'm starting, Mark Breslow is first on this list. Before I unmute you, Mark, I am also going to remind folks that this presentation is actually already online at that 2050 Roadmap website. And so any links to any of the studies we referenced are there and are embedded in that PDF. As well as the audio recordings from the first two in-person meetings that we did hold. And so with that, I am going to unmute Mark and go ahead with your comments.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm particularly concerned about the 2030 goal or policy design because, as you know, the IPCC is saying we need to make emissions reductions quite quickly. And I've got a couple of questions about that. One is whether the policies, all the policies included in the IAC list of policies from last year are going to be included in the modeling, or only some of them. And will you be taking feedback on what policies should be included in the modeling? And I'm particularly interested in the model. The IAC list has policies for carbon pollution pricing of 3 types in it. One for buildings, one for transportation, and economy-wide. And I want to know whether all 3 of those will be included in the modeling. Yes.
Great,
I'm done.
thank you very much, Mark. And that was nice and short. The next person is Paul Popenshalk that I'll be unmuting. But just short answer, Mark, is that as many of them as can be modeled, we are working to model, and we'll be having future IAC meetings to continue discussion around policy. So that will be an opportunity to kind of follow and participate in that process as those are public meetings. So with that, I'm going to unmute Paul. So I think, go ahead.
Good morning, Paul Poppenchak. My question is, does the report address the need for our society to reduce our lifestyle and natural resource consumption because we vastly exceed the carrying capacity of the environment? And it seems to me if we don't address that, we are fooling ourselves.
Thank you, Paul. I think as best as we can, a lot of the report elements rely on human intervention. So, David Hyman, I'm going to be unmuting you next. But Paul, I will note one comment we've gotten is how we can learn from COVID-19 related changes in the past couple of weeks. And that's definitely something that we are thinking through how to take account for some of these human behavioral systematic changes. But thank you for your comment. And David, I am unmuting you now.
Okay, this is David Hyman. Yesterday had an interesting webinar about the En-ROADS climate model. Quite fascinating. I mean, one thing, quick question is, do you use such climate models, En-ROADS or otherwise? And the other is, it's like a game, you could run scenarios, and the ones they ran all seem to show that it was be difficult to even get started, less and
Hello?
okay. Hello?
Yeah, David, sorry.
You know, David.
Okay. I had an interrupt. Did you get my question?
Using an En-ROADS climate modeling, that's a
that was one, and the other is they tried a few scenarios, and they all showed practically nothing happening before 2050 in terms of impact on greenhouse gas and temperatures. Are you getting similar results? So that's the two questions.
And do you want to field any of that quickly?
Yeah, sure. The quick answer is yeah, we do use climate models. We've had quite a bit of research from some colleagues at the University of Massachusetts who have helped to downscale global climate models, the kinds that the IPCC uses when they issue their reports, to get a sense of the expected weather and climate impacts that we'll see over the next 30, 100 years. I would definitely recommend taking a look at resilientma.org. That's got all of that research posted. It's a great and wonderful data portal. And that can also tell you a little bit more about sort of where we're headed in terms of temperature and emissions impacts.
Thank you. Carolyn Britt, I'm unmuting you, and this is, I didn't state it at the onset, I apologize. Please do introduce yourself and any affiliation you'd like to share before your comments. But Carolyn, you are off mute, so please go ahead. Oh, although I'm not hearing you. Carolyn, I'll give you another minute. Okay, it is perhaps not working. I'm going to go down to Steve and Cal, and Carolyn will try to circle back with you. But Steve, you should be unmuted. Can you speak?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I got one interesting question, which is, have you taken into consideration the issue of food and bio waste composting that creates methane? This is a very significant contributor. Methane is really bad, much worse than carbon CO2. Has that been incorporated? Because that's one of the things we're looking at, for the future, is this whole question of how do we address dealing with composting our food and other kinds of waste.
Thanks, Steve, for that. That is part of our non-energy emissions analysis, and definitely something that we're looking at and ways to mitigate the emissions from that. Ben, do you want to say anything else there?
Yeah, just that we have models that are looking at all of that, the interconnection of the waste combustors, diversion of organics, diversion of plastics, recycling, and trying to uphold the tenets of Mass DEP's solid waste master plan. So it's all part of the non-energy model.
Great, thank you, Steve. Heather Klisch, I've unmuted you. Heather, go ahead. And please, your name and affiliation, please.
Hi, yes, sorry, I was getting my son a snack at the same time. Let me get back to this. My question is this, it's Heather Klisch from the Appalachian Mountain Club, and I was noting when you were talking about carbon sequestration that Massachusetts forests, our carbon sequestration capacity doesn't eclipse our energy consumption, for instance. And I'm wondering if in the scenario planning, if only Massachusetts forests will be considered or will techniques to say purchase sequestration from other locations, other surrounding states, also be considered kind of in the same way that we might consider, of course, purchasing electricity from electricity that would be generated outside of Massachusetts?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I think that's definitely in the realm of consideration. So that's noted, and if you have more thoughts on that, I'd encourage you to submit public comments. I encourage everyone to, but that one in particular, if there's data sources or pieces you want us to consider, that would be really helpful. But great, thank you, Heather.
Okay, great. We'll focus on that. Thanks.
We'll go to Vince Maraventano. Vince, I am unmuting you. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Vince Maraventano, Massachusetts Interfaith Power and Light. We have 250 congregational members. I have two related questions. The broader question is regarding the social and health studies. The chart indicated they'll be done for each of the sectors. So the first question is, will there be a separate social and equity report for the all economy model? The more particular question is, given the uncertainty about the health of the economy after the COVID virus crisis, will there be economic modeling based on different levels of economic capacity to provide funding? And I asked that question because a carbon pricing policy would not require public revenues, which I'm guessing are going to be extremely scarce for the next couple of years.
Thank you, Vince. Han, do you want to take the equity question?
Yeah, sure. So, good question, Vince. Oh, I hear myself echoing, so I hope this is okay. We are making sure that our study, as well as our process, is as inclusive as possible. And so we've been engaging with a number of stakeholders on climate justice issues to make sure that we incorporate the right framework to think about a just transition and what that means for everyone. And so there won't be a separate equity report that you asked about, but what we will do is have the analysis incorporate that, incorporate equity into the policy, the scenario, and as well as the development of policies. So it should run through the 2050 roadmap report, and it should also get reflected in our 2030 clean energy and climate plan. So that was answering one of your questions. What was the other question?
Yeah, on the economic modeling, I think we're going to do, things are really changing in different ways. So it's going to be, we're trying to make it as relevant and realistic and up to date as possible on the economic modeling. But I think that appreciate your feedback. And if you have additional comments or suggestions there, please feel free to submit them, and we can dive through them more. I want to move to Steve Long. I am unmuting you now. Steve, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Steve Long with the Nature Conservancy. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you for all the work you're doing. And I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. And I'm wondering if you could, this is about emissions reductions and biosequestration from the land and forest sector. And I think it would be helpful to clarify the current role of natural and working lands in the current accounting and how things might look different in net zero and what cautions we're taking to avoid unintended consequences in the process that you're going through. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Ben or Han, I see either of you jump in there.
Yeah,
well,
so if I can clarify what I said earlier, when someone asked about like the cutting of forests, if that's reflected in the inventory. Sorry, Ben, to jump in this first before you speak. So just wanted to clarify that the greenhouse gas emissions inventory does track carbon sink and biogenic carbon emissions, but in the current framework of the GWSA, we are, I guess, counting GWSA compliance in terms of gross emissions reduction. And so that's emissions from, and the reductions from in the building sector, transportation sector, electric sector, and the non-energy sector, which includes ag and refrigerants and industrial processes, et cetera, et cetera. In the context of net zero, yes, that's when we think about how can we then not just track biogenic emissions, but like have it counted towards netting out gross emissions reduction. And so that's something that our analysis very much would like to help us figure out. Go ahead, Ben.
No, that was great.
I am moving now to Paul Lipke. Paul, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Paul Lipke with Healthcare Without Harm. My question is, how is health costs, morbidity, not just mortality, being considered and factored in, particularly considering that morbidity is often undervalued or not valued at all?
Claire, do you want me to take that
Paul.
one?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Ben.
Sure. So we have a couple different models that are going to be looking at socioeconomic impacts. The primary tool that we're using is a model called IMPLAN, which is a macroeconomic model. It sounds a little funny to think about it this way, but we translate health impacts into dollars. And that includes not just deaths, but also, missed work days from, say, asthma, or overall sickness, morbidity, as opposed to mortality. That gets factored in, and we'll be taking coefficients that are pretty well established and published by the US EPA in terms of connecting things like air pollution to those factors. That's a pretty, I wouldn't say straightforward analysis, but the sort of approach to it is well established.
And thanks, Paul. I'm going to actually go back now to Carolyn Britt and to try to get your line working. Carolyn, I've unmuted you. Can you speak? Okay, I'll come back to you in a bit. Janine Cahill, I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm asking. I would like the slides because I couldn't really digest as we were going through all of the details. So please give us a chance to really absorb what was presented. And what I'm concerned about is this is all very granular in funneling down this information on the GWSA's objectives. But I think the state has a lot of conflicting policies. Looking at our current recycling system as an example of well-intentioned policy that has ended up in kind of a train wreck. And I can kind of see what we're doing here as potentially leading us down a path that doesn't really make sense in 10 years. I'm concerned about what we're doing with incentivizing, or at least not questioning, current natural gas infrastructure. And I don't know how natural gas figured into the inventory and all of the leakage. I'm also concerned about, dual, we're using forests as sinks, but we're also going to be burning biomass as has been proposed. I really think the state needs a very overly, a huge umbrella under which to do all of this. And I think waiting till, people get around to adopting the best available technology in 2030 is just not a policy solution. That's a policy disaster. We're on a brink. We know we're on a brink. We know Greenland is melting. The rates at which we're planning and foreseeing this problem are just not in sync with what we're up against. Massachusetts leads the nation in a lot of ways, and I would like to know how we plan to lead the nation really fast by adopting much more, by going at the level of producer, the producer of these fuels, of these sectors, rather than waiting for the individual to decide whether or not they really want to opt in. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jean. I had very helpful feedback. Glenn Ayers, I'll unmute you next. Just a couple of things I wanted to react to that relate to the study. Gas leaks are part of both the current inventory as well as part of our analysis. So that is being factored in there. And then I think otherwise a lot of what you've raised are active issues that we're trying to address. So appreciate the comment. So Glenn, I am unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Glenn Ayers from Mass Forest Rescue. And recently, numerous states have done analysis that show that forestry, forest degradation, and land use changes turn out to be a major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, but Massachusetts has not released. The state has refused to release that kind of analysis results. Meanwhile, we have agencies like DCR and DFW that are conducting large-scale land clearing deforestation projects, such as the Montague Plains, Muddy Brook Wildlife Management Area, and over 12,000 acres of forest degraded by the Department of so-called Conservation and Recreation. And I'm wondering when the state will do an analysis that shows what the impacts from forestry are as far as loss of carbon storage on state-owned public lands, and also the ongoing emissions from past activities of forest degradation and the ongoing planned activities that will be releasing greenhouse gases, CO2, for the next several decades into the future, and then why the current best management practices do not include they do not address anything having to do with climate change, carbon storage, or carbon sequestration. Those best management practices are incredibly out of date considering the climate emergency that we're in. And we need to also look at the Chapter 61 incentives that incentivize the destruction of our carbon storage and sequestration capacity through incentives, tax reductions, and other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Lots of notes there, and it's definitely something that we're looking at. Ben or Han, do you want to weigh in any further there?
Yeah, so thank you for raising your concern and your questions. Just know that in our analysis, we have, I think Claire already covered this already, have on board Harvard Forest to help us analyze what the land use sector can do to help us further reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as increase and so enhance the carbon sequestration in our land. And so they're going to help us analyze what are the greenhouse gas emissions impact from different forestry practices. And our study will be able to enlighten us on that. And we are very in close communication with folks at DCR, as well as Division of Fish and Wildlife, about biogenic carbon and their context in the net zero target. And so we are still working through the analysis, but the analysis will help us with further discussion with the agencies and for us to evaluate what's the best way to move forward on managing our public and private land. I just wanted to point out that there are different opinions of how we should treat our forests, how we should best manage them. And so just know that we understand from the climate perspective, as well as from an ecological perspective, and we're going to look into what are the different trade-offs between preserving our natural forests for habitats, for term health, as well as making sure that we can still get a net zero or reach our net zero goal by 2050. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. And I am realizing we have a long line of hands still, so I think we're going to try to keep our answers shorter, but all of your comments are recorded or are part of the recording, and the recording will be posted on the website for everyone to hear. And I think we have a lot of comments coming in on the chat function, so I think we might also post that accompanying with it so that we kind of have the full documentation of this. So one thing I do want to flag, IMPLAN is IMPLAN. That's a question on IMPLAN. And then there was another question. But so with that, I will go now to Brian Campbell. Brian, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Brian Campbell. I was wondering if there's any legislation in the works because Baker was extending RECs by changing the date of the RECs to non-carbon.
I'm sorry, Brian. The audio is really poor, so we are not able to understand you. I'm muting you now. If it's possible for you to call in on a phone line, please do so, or if there's anything else you can do, and I'll try to circle back to you, but I'm sorry, your comment was not coming through. I'm going to go now to Richard Fennelly. Richard, I'm unmuting you now.
Yes, hi. Actually, utilities should incentivize the better preventative maintenance of air conditioning and refrigeration, particularly commercial refrigeration. Most owners don't clean the heat transfer coils or the filters. And from Carbon Trust data, it was a global study in 2018, if everybody did preventative maintenance on their refrigeration and AC units, the emissions, the power plant emissions in Massachusetts, we estimate would drop by almost 3.5 million metric tons. They said it's a huge opportunity for energy savings and emissions reduction. And I know of no political entity in the world that's paying attention to this obvious way to cut emissions.
Great, thank you, Richard. And we've also received your written comments on this, so you appreciate the comment. I'm going now to Stephen.
We're here to help you out.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Richard. Sorry, I unmuted you mid-sentence. But Stephen, go ahead.
Yes, greetings. My name is Steve Fink. I'm a local volunteer in Andover, but I'm also part of Vince's church community for Massachusetts Interfaith Power and Light, and very active in the AMC. So there's who I am. My question is, a lot of what we're talking about is big picture, but ultimately local action will govern what happens here. And I was wondering how we might come up together with a playbook of specific things people can do locally. To use two quick examples to frame it, our students here in Andover worked with the state agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, to set up a recycling program, both in this community and neighboring communities, which has been very successful. We need to see more things like that, where we can take the big picture you're painting for us and make it mean something for our students. Second thing, I'm going to go with Vince again. Gee whiz, we started putting solar panels on top of churches, and Vince's organization spread that across the state and now across the country. And in so many communities, people are seeing, oh, you can do this. Here's a playbook, it exists, Vince has it, for how to put solar panels up on the roof of your church. So I'm just hoping when we get into this a little further, it will quickly turn into what we can all do locally to drive change and engage our communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. So I'm going next to Sally Pick. Sally, I'm unmuting you now. Oh, it looks like you were self-muted. If you can, there you go. It looks like it's green on my end. Go ahead, Sally.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Yes, okay. I have two questions. My affiliations are many. I've been on the Energy Committee in my town in Montague for years. Work professionally advising homeowners on energy efficiency and renewables, and have been active in this in legislative activism lately. So anyhow, quickly, two questions that I've typed in also, so they'll be on record. Do the net zero emissions goals include purchasing of renewable energy certificates or RECs, which I view as not bringing new greenhouse gas emission reductions into the system, but just funding existing ones? That's my first question. So I'll start there.
Ben, do you want to respond to that one?
Sure. I'm not sure I totally understand the question. It's will the sink side of our net zero include the purchase of RECs?
Yeah.
Okay. It's possible. That would be one of many approaches that we would look at in terms of trying to identify a way of creating an accounting system that can quantify and verify the carbon sequestration associated with a certain action. Once that action has occurred, some sort of a REC or an offset or a RIN or any number of other acronyms could be applied. We have to do a lot of work over the next months to years in order to develop a robust accounting system to create RECs that actually, or whatever the right terminology will end up being, that actually do apply to verifiable, quantifiable, and permanent reductions in emissions or net sequestrations.
Okay. My next comment slash question is, I'm aware that the state is working on putting out a draft regulations to phase out hydrofluorocarbons that are refrigerants used in heat pumps as well as other refrigeration uses that have an enormous impact on the climate. So I'm wondering if you're, aware of that, if you're working with the folks who are working on that, and if, some of my concerns are that since those regulations haven't come out yet, will they include existing heat pumps and the need to switch out those refrigerants and incentives for that, as well as what I understand that the key point is that having those getting into the atmosphere is at the end of the life of a heat pump, is when they, if they're not properly disposed of and destroyed, then they get released into the atmosphere. But also there's an issue with leakage over time. So I'm just wondering if those kinds of issues are being looked at as you're going forward with this planning.
Yeah, we are aware of the regulations going forward, and our non-energy model is actually, it's got an input line for the number of heat pumps that are sold and a life cycle assumption about refrigerants that leak during the operation of those heat pumps, as well as at end of life, and with both sort of policy and non-policy options in terms of what refrigerant might be used in them.
Great, and I'll just remind folks, we probably won't be able to respond so much moving forward, just to work through all the comments, but we will do our best. So Marcia Hart, I am unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have 3 process questions. I'm wondering how this effort was communicated to the public, because very few people that I know were aware of this. I'm wondering how I get to read the comments that are submitted by other members of the public. I'm really interested in reading them and often learn as much from the public as I do from the experts. And I'm wondering why there's only one avenue for public comment, being this avenue. Often, at least in federal efforts like this, after a draft is produced, the public comments on the draft, or the comments of your consultants are available prior to a process like this one where we get to comment. So it's very difficult to comment on a process that you don't have the information for ahead of listening to a conversation like this one today. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. I think the big piece I'll underscore is that we are going to be posting as much information as we can in regards to public comments and comments on this webinar at the mass.gov/2050 roadmap website. So that's really the clearinghouse for more. And if you have ideas or feedback that specifically of other pieces that we should be doing, please submit those. And I'll also just note that the Implementation Advisory Committee is our kind of public body that hosts a series of public meetings. So that's another public avenue that I want to flag. So I'm going to go to Lisa Cunningham. Lisa, I am unmuting you now. It looks like you were self-muted, but if you can take your line off mute. Okay, I'm going to move then to Kate O.C. Kate, I just unmuted you. Go ahead, Kate.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm looking at your graph of the historical greenhouse gas emissions in Mass by major sectors, and I see that food is completely missing from that. So I would like to know what consideration has the Commission taken for the emissions impacts of people's food choices, particularly with respect to which foods have the greatest climate emissions, which certainly the people of Massachusetts contribute to whether or not the food is grown in Massachusetts. We're still the consumers of those foods, and our choices impact those, make impacts on those emissions. So I wanted to know, first what your considerations of food impacts have been, and also what steps are you suggesting to educate and direct the public to make appropriate food choices for reducing emissions. Things like, purchasing food grown from agricultural practices like organic growing that sequester carbon, plant-based diets that reduce methane emissions from livestock, reducing food waste, composting food waste here in the Commonwealth, reducing packaging and buying local to reduce transportation costs. I don't see any of that in your presentation. So I'm wondering what considerations you've been making for food choices.
Great, thanks, Kate. Just quickly, the Solid Waste Master Plan is part of this and has a lot of that with the Department of Environmental Protection. They have a draft out now, and I would just also reference the greenhouse gas inventory that Han described, but that was out to public comment and doesn't include a lot of embodied emissions or life cycle emissions. However, there are a lot of considerations. So thank you for the comment. I'm going to move to Joel Wool, just trying to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. So Joel, I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Joel from the Office of Boston City Councilor Lydia Edwards. Just by reference, the councilor represents a district in Boston that includes Logan Airport and several environmental justice communities. I just wanted to ask two questions. I sent them in writing, so I won't belabor the point. There was a discussion just earlier about engagement with EJ communities. I was just curious if part of the broader macro greenhouse gas reduction target setting process might consider either location-based target or looking at the concentration of emissions. Presumably, to some degree, there's going to be a correlation between where facilities emitting greenhouse gas pollutants and toxic or air quality impacting ones. I also just have a specific question, which I hope staff can look into. There was a budget requirement for EAEA to do a review of the environmental justice impacts of climate change on communities of color, which is probably relevant to the earlier question I asked. I'm just curious if that report happened and if it's visible.
Great, thank you very much, Joel. Noted, and we'll follow up on your specific question. I'll move now to Gia Neswald. Gia, I am unmuting you on my end. It looks like you're self-muted, but you might be able to take yourself off mute. Give you a second to do so. All right, then I'll circle back to you, Gia. Emily Dropkin is next. Emily, I've just unmuted you. Go ahead, Emily.
Hi, thank you. This is Emily. I'm, among other things, part of Extinction Rebellion Western Mass. I wanted to think back to part of what Vince was saying and others before about coronavirus and what it means in this moment. It was strange to watch this and not have any mention of the climate disasters that are likely to strike in the next 30 years, some of which will be worse than what we're facing in this moment. And I wonder how that's being considered, but then also, how are we considering that there's a chance we'll come out of this current crisis more committed to averting future ones and willing to make more of a change as a society because we have a glimpse of what societal disruption from the climate emergency might look like. And then again, with coronavirus, I also think that the economic outcomes in this moment are going to dramatically change what seems possible for better and for worse. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. We are moving through this, I guess, together. So we are looking at the potential impacts of climate, and that was one of the scenarios that Ben shared, and trying to consider as best we can, kind of along the lines of more natural disasters related to the impacts of climate change. But as for the coronavirus impact, that's, I think, really an open question. And I would say generally, we welcome ideas on this. I think that's something that the entire consultant team, everyone at EEA is really trying to make sense of as best we can, while we're also, in the process of being impacted by it. So, and at this point, I would say, Ben or Han, if you guys want to jump in, just go for it. But otherwise, I'll just try to make sure we can get through everyone. And I'm going next to Chris Riddle. Chris, I have unmuted you on my end. It looks like you are self-muted on your microphone. I'm not sure if you're able to unmute yourself. If not, I'm going to go to Stephen Malagodi. Stephen, I have just unmuted you. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve Malagodi from 350 Mass Lowell node. I have a specific question in that the GWSA calls for the 2030 emissions limit to be set this year, but the technical details of the roadmap plan isn't going to be ready, as I understand it, until maybe December of this year. So how do you meaningfully set 2030 limits without having this fundamental data? So that's a specific question, but I just want to make a comment that, and I think you can hear it reflected by many of the other callers. The GWSA is now 12 years old, and yet we seem to be lacking really basic data and modeling plans to get this accomplished. So there seems to be a real lack of urgency, not just in the administration, but in the legislature itself, to actually get this accomplished. And the young woman from Extinction Rebellion put it very well. If you don't take the science seriously and your infrastructure isn't ready, you wind up with the situation that we're in with the coronavirus. So, I just don't see any kind of lack of, I don't see any kind of sense of urgency from the government sector in this crisis. Also, just to finish that, I think that the equity report needs to be a separate report. I don't see anything about equity really mentioned in your presentation today. So to say that it's just going to be folded into whatever you're going to do in the future, I don't think is is sufficient. I think it needs a separate report. Thank you very much. And if you could address the 2030 limits, that would be great.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Ben, do you want to take the 2030 limit?
Sure. So the modeling plan is really to go out to 2050, and we're conducting the modeling exercise now. And then we'll be sort of looking backwards from 2050 to 2030 to 2020 and using the tenets of what we need to do in 2050 to help us chart out what we need to do in the next 10 years. So the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which will achieve the 2030 emissions limit, is all informed by the 2050 modeling. All the reports might get published sort of all at once or phased in over the next few months, but the entire study will be concluded by the time we publish all three of those things.
Great. So I think I'll go to Harry Monroe. Harry, I'm unmuting you now.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for taking my comment. My name is Harry Monroe. I'm with the Sunrise Movement in Boston. Noting that a lot of the scientists are saying that 2050 is really the place where we need to get to zero emissions, but Massachusetts is one of the most liberal and wealthy regions of the U.S., if not the world. We should really be leading the pack here to decrease emissions and to move towards more renewable energies. Are you taking that into account in your modeling, that really we need to be much more aggressive than the average communities in reducing our emissions to make an example and to lead the world in this effort?
Thanks for the comment, Harry. I think kind of to that one and to Steve, I think we are definitely wanting to put forward a path that the other states or other countries can emulate. I guess I'll maybe leave it at that. We're almost at the 10:30 mark, so I want to remind folks that this mass.gov/2050 roadmap is the website where all of this information will be. The slides are already up there. The recording from our first two in-person audio recording is available there, and we also will be posting this recording and the comments from this webinar at that website as well. So please look out for that. It'll be a couple of days for the technology to settle and for us to get that up there, but that will be the website where it lives, and that's also where you can submit written comments on the 2050 limit by April 10th, as well as on the general comments on the study. I think at this point we have worked through most of the comments. There definitely are still some hands up and folks that I'm hoping if I unmute you, the audio will work. So I think that we will stay on for a couple minutes to hopefully, if we're able to get those public comments out and the audio working, we will work our way through the remaining folks with their hands up. But I think we'll probably say no new hands at this point since we're at the hour. So I'm going to start with Gia. Gia, I'm unmuting you, and it looks like you're still muted on your end. But if you can unmute yourself,
I'm here.
Okay, great. Yes, go ahead, Gia.
Thank you. I'm with Gia Neswald with Wendell State Forest Alliance and the Climate Disobedience Center. We've been asking questions about land use since November in regard to this study, which is well underway. We are still, I met you at the Worcester meeting and asked questions about whether modeling incorporated alternate futures of proforestation, which is to essentially leave our forests uncut, at least our public forests. I'm very disappointed that you still don't have answers for me as to whether that is a consideration in one of the scenarios. essentially, I'm hearing non-answers. I understand that you're doing your best. I appreciate that you're here, but I'm not satisfied, and I'd like to encourage others to join me in, if you're not happy with this process, to make that known, not just in the comments. If it pertains to sequestration and land use, please CC Kurt Gartner and Kathleen Theoharides and write letters to your editor about this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Gia. Yeah, I know you were planning to come to one of the other in-person meetings, and it would have been nice to see you again, but here we are on webinar. So I'll go to Lisa Cunningham. Lisa, I'm unmuting you. It looks like you are self-muted, but if you can get off mute, you can go ahead with your comment.
Actually, Claire, sorry to do this, but can I just provide one clarification?
Go for it.
To Gia, that for the land use analysis that Harvard Forest is doing for us, there is a grow-only scenario where we look at what happens if there is no, management of forests in our Commonwealth. What will the carbon sink potential would be? So just want to leave it at that.
Thanks, Han. Lisa, I'm still not seeing you unmuted, so I'm going to try to go to Mish McCall, who you also look self-muted, but if you can go ahead. Go ahead. Oh, Mish, are you there? It looks green on my end, but we can't hear you. Okay, I'll move down to Brian Campbell. Brian, hopefully the audio is better than last time. Brian,
can you hear me okay now?
Yes, that's much better.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, back in 2016, the Globe, 2018, the Globe put out an editorial. It asked about extending clean energy credits to Seabrook by backdating the 2016 law for RECs to 1990, the year that Seabrook opened. Is there any way that Massachusetts could Seabrook better than what it's doing right now?
Can you repeat the very last element? Is there any way Massachusetts can
support nuclear power plant by because in its non-carbon generation?
Okay,
So
still
the
garbling.
Mass Department of Environmental Protection is currently, it has its, in addition to the renewable energy, renewable portfolio standard, there's also a clean energy standard. And they're in some preliminary hearings and fact finding about potentially expanding that in order to allow pre-existing clean energy sources to qualify for clean energy credits.
Well, I hope that it does get passed.
Great, thank you, Brian. I'll go back to Carolyn. Britt, I know you've written in some comments, but it's looking green now. Carolyn, if you would still like to say anything, go for it. Oh shoot, okay, we can't hear you, Carolyn, but I noticed your comments came in, so we have them written down. I'll go to Glenn Ayers. Glenn, I believe you spoke again. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Glenn? Okay, if not, I believe we've made it through the list. I'll do one last call. If there's anyone who wants to be unmuted that is not able to raise your hand, we can take you off mute before wrapping up the call. And we'll just advance to the next slide. That again, written feedback, we really welcome that, as well as all your comments here. We really appreciate it. I didn't have to cut anybody off for a time limit, so I really appreciate that. We were able to move through many comments today, so I appreciate your consideration here. And I generally, this was not our intention for these public meetings. We had plans to move throughout the state to hold these meetings in person, but as I'm sure each and every one of you is dealing with, COVID, the coronavirus doesn't respect your plans. So I really appreciate everyone bearing with us, and please continue to send your comments, and if you do have any process improvements or suggestions, you can also send them our way, and we will do our best to accommodate. So Ben or Han, do you guys want to have any closing comments before we end the webinar?
Just want to say thank you again for your time and all the comments that you have received, that you have submitted, both written and brought up today. So thank you again.
Yeah, same here.
All right, we wish you all the best in this kind of unprecedentedly challenging time, and we will be posting materials in the coming days at this website on the screen. And with that, we will conclude this meeting. Thank you again for your time and consideration, and more to come soon. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day and a good weekend. Goodbye.